Thank you so much. And thank you for that generous off the cuff intro. I feel no need to elaborate on that. Let me get my screen going. Right. So so hey everyone, my name is Jesse. This talk is titled Beyond the Creative Singularity because I wrote an article a few weeks back getting at sort of a set of ideas that we'll talk through today. So just saying off the top, I'll have the link in one of the following slides. But if you want to kind of dive deeper into some of the things that come up today, it's in that article. I also write about this stuff in my newsletter, Reality Studies. So what are we talking about when we say the creative singularity? The first thing to flag, this is probably not surprising to anyone, but obviously the past year has been pretty wild. We've seen a ton of pieces of news coming out of this murky subject of generative AI that has made a lot of headlines and sort of provoked a lot of takes. One set of those takes is the talk of the singularity, and I added the spooky hands because there's a growing chorus of people who are extremely concerned about the subject of existential risk as we develop generative AI. And I should sort of rewind for a second and say that generative AI is one of these kind of like container buzzwords where as soon as you start trying to actually identify what technologies we're talking about, it starts to get a little blurry, like where the boundaries are. And for that reason, I think it's a frustrating term in the same way that, the metaverse was and continues to be a frustrating term, which is not to say they're not useful and not important terms. It's simply to say that it can lead a lot of different people down a lot of different paths in conversation. And so some people might not be seeing some of this talk of the singularity. So for those of you who are well familiar, feel free to mute me for a minute. But essentially, the singularity is the supposed idea where an artificial superintelligence explodes at such a rapid rate that it displaces the human species as the dominant species on Earth and, renders human civilization moot. And it kind of dovetails with a lot of narratives that we see in science fiction. Obviously, Terminator and The Matrix come to mind. But there's a lot of anthropocentrism projected onto the development of machine intelligence. And one thing that I was really thinking about a lot is I essentially have a distaste for the term AI, and I have a distaste for the evolutionary framework of artificial intelligence moving from narrow to general to super intelligence. I think that as we're developing machine intelligence, we're already witnessing the ways that calling certain types of intelligence artificial or narrow don't really make any sense. We're trying to situate it within a language of intelligence that we can relate to, but I think it leads us down maybe the wrong path for the types of concerns that we should have and that we should be talking about. And so I was thinking about how do we take language that is currently in the zeitgeist and kind of nudge it in ways that I think can be productive. And just to be clear, I definitely think that this broad bucket of artificial intelligence is worth being very concerned about. And as we've been seeing for a number of years, algorithmic culture is leading to outcomes that in many cases are not liberatory and are oppressive to a number of different people in a number of different ways. And I think there are human solutions to those problems, largely around organizing and the establishment of sensible policy. But I think when you take it to the level of sort of extreme end of the world doomsday type of speak, it shuts people down and it makes people feel barred from participating. So anyway, that's a long way of getting to, I decided to kind of take that idea of the singularity as the end of the world and look at what was happening in the sort of broad category of creative industry, because that's where a lot of the metaphors for this singularity talk were coming from. If AI can produce imagery at this fidelity, or if AI can produce writing at this fidelity, then surely we're moments away from AI, usurping control of the military and activating swarm intelligence and dropping nuclear bombs on American cities and so on and so forth. But if you kind of go a step in and say, well, if we're thinking about singularities, which I know is sort of a funny paradox, but if we're thinking about these critical moments after which everything has changed, but everything has changed can take a more human-oriented and softer interpersonal, interdependent practices type of approach. So that's really what I was thinking about with the creative singularity. Is we've reached this moment where it's hard to imagine going forward that working artists don't interact with generative AI in some capacity. And moreover, where the human dynamics associated with creativity are irrevocably changed. Now, that change could be very small, but it's hard to look at the landscape of available tools and not start to imagine the ways that, whether again subtle or pronounced, that various artists, designers, and other creative professionals won't be impacted. So I broke that out into 4 different topics, which we'll get into, but the sort of jump off point is kind of you referencing the one, the only, the great David Bowie in an interview in 1999, trying to express that the internet was more than just an incremental change in technology. And so I'm just going to briefly play this clip, and I'm hoping that the audio, oh wait, I didn't do the thing when I started. Hold on, I'm going to unshare and reshare.
I don't think we've even seen.
Could folks hear that?
Yep, we gotcha.
Great. All right.
I don't think we've even seen the tip of the iceberg. I think the potential of what the internet is going to do to society, both good and bad, is unimaginable. I think we're actually on the cusp of something exhilarating and terrifying.
It's just a tool, though, isn't it?
No, it's not. No. No, it's an alien life form.
What do you think? I mean, when you think then about the
Is there life on Mars? Yes, it's just landed here.
But it's simply a different delivery system there. You're arguing about something more profound.
Oh yeah, I'm talking about the actual context, and the state of content is going to be so different to anything that we can really envisage at the moment, where the interplay between the user and the provider will be so in simpatico. It's going to crush our ideas of what mediums are all about.
And so that was the when I saw that video a number of years ago, and I was thinking about that video again in terms of, again, narrowing the scope of what generative AI is doing to the realm of creative industries, and also sort of breaking out again of this evolutionary mode of narrow to general to super intelligence. I think there are qualitative changes that even begin, if we're going to take that evolutionary framing, at the level of narrow intelligence that we can't predict in the moment. And moreover, when young people grow up with certain practices, how that manifests when they are sort of in the workforce, these are things that we are notoriously bad at predicting. We're often prone to playing into this phenomenon of the super now or the big now, which is where you take an available technology now and you just assume it gets way bigger and better in the future without thinking through the sort of deeper and more nuanced ways in which it might infiltrate society and sort of weave its way in. So the first category that I wanted to start with was this very buzzy topic of jobs displacement. And so I took a look at automation and creative labor. And so when we're talking about jobs, I think there's some really important things that we need to look at from the perspective of what's the underlying conditions in which jobs are occurring, And then also kind of do that future forward sort of projecting out of what are the ways in which we want to mitigate any type of suffering that automation could bring about. And so I interviewed Mashinka Hakopian, who's a professor at Art Center, a really wonderful thinker, and also the author of the Institute for Other Intelligences. I really encourage everybody to pick up that book. But in talking to her, you can see in these quotes that she has here, I think that this first point is really critical, which she said, the questions that we're seeing crop up now around labor are continuous with the questions that have cropped up around emerging technologies in labor for years, and they've reproduced many of the same blank spots and omissions. Debates around generative adversarial networks and image generators, for example, have been grounded in the labor of the artist that's being extracted, but fewer of them attend to the labor of the data workers who are training these models and the labor conditions under which they're being trained. And here she's referencing to the data labeling that is outsourced to developing countries by Western countries developing these systems, which has been covered a little bit in the news, but has taken up far less of the sort of conversational oxygen as like the no AI art movement, which plays into a general dynamic of privileging the concerns of, generally speaking, wealthier, the populace of wealthier nations. And I think it gets at a larger dynamic when we're talking about where automation first hits and what types of, sort of worker solidarity might be possible in a global labor context. The other thing that she said that I think is really important is when we're talking about creative labor displacement, we also have to talk about what type of creativities are being manifest by these tools. And so if these tools, for instance, are trained on data sets of creative outputs that are within, for instance, like a Western canon of what is quality creativity, then that's going to be what it's recreating, and then therefore reinforcing those modes as, quote, valuable modes of creativity. And so these are really kind of like big and complex issues that when we take it out to the level of doomsday, we're not able to actually start to begin to even think about what does solidarity look like with folks who are working in different countries, from if you're in a sort of wealthier Western nation, all the way to the level of what does solidarity look like when we're talking about the designer or the game developer who's losing their job because generative tools are available and being used by a manager who is now tasked with a number of different generative tools instead of a team of human workers. The next category that I looked at in this piece was the question of augmentation and velocity. And so you hear this topic come up a lot around the subject of co-pilots, where, oh, imagine if you had a tutor for any subject, or imagine if you had essentially like a co-pilot taskmaster that was observing the open tabs and notes that you took and able to serve those to you when you needed them without you even needing to prompt it. And I think this is actually a very rich territory for us to consider. But it also introduces broader changes in the sort of creative ecosystem. So in this section, I interviewed a couple artists, Alexander Reben and Lauren Lee McCarthy. So Alexander puts forward this idea of human-machine symbiosis. And I think this is a really important, again, reflection that technology has been part and parcel with art since the beginning of art. Paint pigments were once new technologies, chisels were once new technologies. The stretch canvas was once a new technology. You don't have art as a form without technology. And so we have in the, let's call it under modernity, so in the past few hundred years, really tried to separate those two ideas and separate them into separate industries. Alexander's point is that these have always been sort of synchronous forces, the inclination to make art and the inclination to make technologies, and the ways that those two things are threaded. And so he says here, the idea of human-machine symbiosis stems from technology as something that is inseparable from humanity. Inventing stone tools and other external means of amplifying our bodies has allowed us to, for example, have more calories and the time to do things like invent science and philosophy. Technology has always been a very human thing. And so I think this speaks to attitudinal shifts as we look at generative AI, which is this is extending a lineage of technology constantly informing what the creative capacities of human beings are. In this case, what we're doing is doing so in an incredibly accelerated fashion. And so that's where we're starting to talk about the velocity side of this category of augmentation and velocity. So you might imagine an artist who is incredibly skilled in certain crafts, but in others is not, and now might have tools to kind of jump those gaps to continue their process and become more multimodal themselves. But you also have the ways that the volume that can then be produced by artists and designers increases by exponents. And so that, as we've seen on social media, even before generative AI, algorithmic culture had already introduced a dynamic where if you're good at gaming discoverability, your work then becomes part of the conversation. It's kind of the no press or no press is bad press sort of idea, where if you can just get your stuff out and sort of like hit print, then you're more likely to be discovered and more likely to have success, more likely to have future opportunities, future jobs, so on and so forth. But this also has changed how we approach the experience of receiving creative content, of art, of design. And so I was talking to Lauren Lee McCarthy, who created P5, which is a code-based or a tool that allows artists with minimal to no understanding of code to begin working with code. And so I was talking to her about how she imagines these changes in velocity to impact the audience of folks like us who will be sort of receiving this work. And her perspective was, I think we will see less of that kind of work because it's less financially sustainable. If that work does become a trend, it would represent a huge loss in culture and our ability to process and understand the world through the art and culture around us. Because that's what art is doing. It's giving us a way to make sense of what's happening. So everything's happening faster, and there's less work that is created with the appropriate time and space to provide that. And I think this is a really critical point, because it's easy to look at generative tools and say, well, this probably means that on balance, we're going to encounter much more high quality visual offerings and auditory offerings. But there's also this flip side of the question, which is like, art is not just aesthetics, and we'll get to this a little bit more in a second. Art also has to do with the critical engagement of that artist with what's going on in the world as an embodied human being. And some of that work is going on completely off screen, in the books they're reading and research they're doing, in the time they're sitting staring out into space. And so it's not to say that we can sort of put these two things on a balance and try to compare them, of saying, oh, well, lots of more people who didn't imagine they could be creative can now be creative, and we'll also be able to see way more high quality stuff, versus we maybe will have less space for artists who are taking this more critical, more sort of like high engagement approach to their craft. These are not things that we can kind of compare and say like, well, if we get this, then it's fine to lose this. It's more to say all of these things are potentially happening now, and what values we bring into the development of generative tools will inform how we build everything from social networks to future generative tools to the ways that we're gathering and cleaning data and so on and so forth. So this gets into the question of aesthetics and artistry. So one of the things that I've been tracking in my curatorial work over the past, closing in on a decade now, is the way that algorithmic tools are granting us new modes of aesthetics. And this has largely taken place, from my view, with generative adversarial networks, which are the form of machine learning that you would most likely have encountered through deepfakes, but also have been used by artists for any number of sort of creative projects. And prior to these large models that have these vast data sets to be able to, and also reinforcement learning to kind of get to the level where we now have with Midjourney and DALL-E 2, where you're really getting pretty photorealistic results. Beforehand, there was a much more material quality. You could really tell when somebody had produced something using a GAN, for instance. So at that time, I was really thinking about what that meant as aesthetic expression. And there's some really great scholarship around the idea of the soft image. And if folks are interested in this realm, I'd really encourage you to read that book. But the general idea is like, you're not looking at a static image anymore. You're looking at a representational view of a database. And I think that phenomenon still very much applies, but we don't see it in the aesthetics as much anymore. And I think this brings us to a really fascinating place when we're starting to talk about genre in particular. And so many of you probably saw that there was this trend of Wes Anderson style things in the past couple months. It started on TikTok with people just presenting their lives in a Wes Anderson sort of editing style, sort of hyperbolic Wes Anderson style, but it very quickly became something that people were riffing on using generative tools. So I'm going to briefly play a little bit of this, not the whole thing, to give a sense of what I'm talking about.
In the quaintest corner of Middle-earth, embark on an epic journey unlike any you've experienced before. This winter, Wes Anderson presents a heartwarming and quirky adaptation of a beloved classic, The Whimsical Fellowship. Meet Frodo Baggins, an unassuming hobbit, chosen for an extraordinary task. Guided by the enigmatic wizard Gandalf, Frodo embarks on a captivating journey with a colorful crew. Follow these heroes as they traverse idyllic country.
So you can see, and you can even see on the recommended portion, there's a Wes Anderson Star Wars, there's a Wes Anderson Avatar. There were many of these, and you've probably, even if not the Wes Anderson version, seen, 90s nightclub parties with Harry Potter characters, or a Balenciaga fashion show with Harry Potter characters. My argument for this, and I'm working on an essay about this exact subject at the moment, is that we're actually going to witness something very fascinating with genre becoming sort of calcified in certain ways, in terms of it being metadata for in the style of in text-to-X generators. But it will also liquefy, because more and more people will draw different conclusions about what hallmarks of, for instance, Wes Anderson style are. As we've seen here, it's a lot of, center framed characters and, high saturation color palettes. But when you actually compare this to Wes Anderson films, it more or less ends up feeling like true parody. It doesn't actually feel like it's representational of the sort of hallmarks of his style. And of course, the question then becomes, what happens when things like this exist in the zeitgeist, and then these creators, whatever their output is, whether they're a filmmaker, a painter, or musician, when they encounter all these different ideas out in the zeitgeist, how might that impact the way they approach their own work? And so I think we can view this Wes Anderson moment as an example of what's probably going to happen to tons of different genres, and how people essentially try to own or fork the canons of these genres. So I think we're about to get more obsessed with genre than I think we've been for a very long time, and hybrids, and thinking about sort of toying with those. But the genre is also about to become, in some sense, meaningless, because everybody can kind of start to participate in this hive mind approach to sort of warping what genre is. So where this gets at artistry, or what I want to surface, is this. I think it's really wonderful that this quote, "Good artists copy, great artists steal," is actually multiple levels of paraphrase, because it sort of gets at the idea that's being sort of presented here. But good artists copy, great artists steal. What that's getting at is not that artists ought to be plagiarists. It's getting at, as an artist is training, the way that they develop their style is by somewhat literally trying on the hats of other great artists, and sort of moving through the artistic decisions that those artists made to produce the work that they produced, and that it is only in doing this that many artists were ever able to develop an idiosyncratic style, because they were moving through the influences in their own lives. And so jumping to this, the second quote that I have here, there's a fantastic article. There's actually a few fantastic, Ted Chiang has written a number of fantastic articles recently for the New Yorker about generative AI. I really recommend you read all of them. But in this one, he's arguing that no form of output from a large language model is a beneficial starting point for young writers. If you're a writer, you'll write a lot of unoriginal work before you write something original. And the time and effort expended on that unoriginal work isn't wasted. It is precisely what enables you to eventually create something original. The hours spent choosing the right word and rearranging sentences to better follow one another are what teach you how meaning is conveyed by prose. And I think this is a really lucid way of describing a phenomenon that is true for all artists. If you're able to instantly text to image your way to an understanding, or to outputs of that might be in your mind related to, for instance, say Wes Anderson is a big influence for you as a filmmaker, and you're able to kind of hack your way to reproducing what you deem to be Wes Anderson style films, did you miss out in any way in the process of having to really learn what it took to make that, and the more than just the aesthetic choices, but the conceptual choices that made that a meaningful piece of art or design? And Ted Chiang's argument is that you miss out on that entirely in writing. And my sense is that's probably true for most forms of art. Now, do most things need to rise to the level of what we would call art? I think that's an open question, and one that we'll inevitably find ourselves exploring more. But I think one thing we really want to keep an eye on in this coming period of time is, how are we training young artists and designers not to be scared of generative tools, but still to potentially do some of that hard, frustrating, banging your head against the wall style work to make sense of what, the sort of their influences did in the years before them.
In the quaintest corner of Middle Earth.
And so the final category is convergence and emergence. And this is sort of hinted at in the aesthetics and artistry question, but from a broad collective level social dynamic, I think there's some things for us to look at. Stephen Marsh Marche, I'm not exactly sure how to say it, I've only ever read it, has written a piece where he sort of coins the term the big blur, that we'll be encountering, that everything we encounter will come with the rider that we have to ask, did a person or a machine make this? And I think that's true, but I think that actually doesn't quite go far enough to this big blur, which is that best practices and insights from many different fields will come to pervade each other. And I think this is that qualitative aspect of, we can only just begin to imagine what that might look like. What might that look like for the best practices of code, medicine, and filmmaking to converge into outputs look like? I think there's a lot of explorations we might imagine, but I think that only time is really going to sort of reveal what those things are. Noah Davis coins this term the third magic, where he breaks down three magics that have occurred in sort of human history. And I'm not necessarily endorsing that these are the three magics, but I think his point about generative AI is a relevant one. So just to do that quickly, he describes history, science, and then AI as the three magics. So the idea is that history, allowing us to record what occurred before to inform what will happen. And that's not just history like the Great Wars, but like, what's your, grandma's chocolate chip cookie recipe? Being able to do that sort of forked our path originally from other mammals. The second magic of science being reducing the complex world to simple, repeatable phenomena, or to formulas to be able to apply across a number of different phenomena. And then the third magic of AI actually sort of inverting the scientific paradigm of saying we'll actually encounter meaningful results before we understand how we got there or what the formula to get there is. And this is sometimes also referred to as the black box problem, that it is often the case with neural networks that a machine is not, we haven't built these models to be able to produce explanations for why they came to the conclusion that they did. And yet they work in the world. And I think that this is a really important thing to be thinking about, and the ways that creativity becomes part of this means of expressing these ideas. And some of the little glimpses that we see of this playing out, there are a couple sort of big news stories around this, where in one case on the left, there's this character Loeb who kept appearing, who they sort of called an AI cryptid. There's another one from before that called Krungus, where this character would appear in a number of different outputs, and it led the folks who had sort of discovered her to start to push deeper and try to see like what context would she appear in. And then, you know, we can all guess at how to say this, but this Apoploe vesriitis or something like that. Some researchers at UT Austin found that when you type that into DALL-E 2, it would always return a bird. And then they found a number of different other sort of strange non-word words that were producing these images. And this speaks to, in these large models, this vast amount of data has been compressed into a latent space. And not to get sort of too technical into that, but that's essentially mathematical representations of the relationships of all the different data. And we then are being confronted with the idea that these models have deduced patterns that we would never even think to look for. And when you start to see this play out, where there's creatures like Loeb and creatures like this, or cryptids like Loeb and creatures like this bird coming from these words, it starts to point to, well, there's potentially relationships between letters, syllables, phrases, spacing of words in our own language that we have no conception of. And all of that is going to start kind of manifesting in ways that we perceive, but also we'll start to understand better as we build more explainable AI. So those are the four categories. I dive deeper and sort of talk to other subject matter experts in that article, so please feel free to go there. But the last thing that I'll say before I hand back over to Josh and we just kind of chop it up is the original meaning of the word apocalypse, which comes from apocalypsis in Greek, is not the end of the world, but an unveiling or revelation. And so when we're talking about the singularity, it often gets talked about as apocalypse, but used as apocalypse as end of the world. And the framework that I've adopted is, if we view this apocalypse as unveiling, then in fact what generative AI is doing is unveiling aspects of the past and present that have needed addressing or that have needed more attention. And it's also unveiling aspects of the future that are worthy of our attention moving forward. And so this creative singularity to me is a critical unveiling and an invitation for all of us to participate in the refinement of these systems, the refinement of the data sets, the type of social work that will need to be done in terms of organizing and the establishment of policy. And my hope is that we move away from the type of rhetoric that disempowers people and causes them to assume that they're not capable of participating, and in fact invite those very people in. So that's what I got, and I will hand over now.
All right, Jesse, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, well, I'm going to start off with a question, and I saw Phil added a question to the chat. If you guys also have any questions, let me know. I'm going to call on Phil next, but I'm going to ask my own question right now. So, one of the things that's really interesting is like, AI. See, I love this idea of the big now. This idea that we just assume that like AI is just going to like extrapolate whatever's happening now, and like sometimes I feel like AI is like as profound as like the creation of like the daguerreotype, and like thinking about like the daguerreotype, and then sort of like saying like, okay, you couldn't imagine going from there to like TikTok. Like that just like takes like a really strange kind of like, like you have to jump a lot in your brain to be able to like think that far ahead. And I don't think we're actually built to do that. But as far ahead as you've thought, like what are the mediums that you kind of see emerging from this?
So I actually go, and by the way, I love that example. And I also like, there's so much we could talk about even just down that path that I think doesn't get talked about the follow-on effects of the daguerreotype to the, obviously celluloid film to just sort of the camera culture that we inherited, both in terms of the social dynamics, but also in terms of like what it did to art. To to me, actually, and Lauren Lee McCarthy, who I referenced in the piece, also makes this, or like I draw this point from her, and it's left me thinking about a lot, is she is actually more interested in the ways that generative AI produces new forms of creative communication rather than like art. And the example she uses is memes. Like at one point in time, any random meme that we encounter today would have taken an incredible amount of time and energy to produce in absence of the tools that in absence of Photoshop, for instance.
Right.
But now memes are a very common form of self-expression. You will send a meme to your friend based on some shared history, this, that, and the other thing memes. I think generative AI, when we look at it as like an effect, like a sort of large scale social effect, that's where I would really direct my attention. Less in terms of like we'll have, photography departments and museums, and more of what new zany forms of, sharing something silly with your friends will come to pass.
All right, I'm gonna follow up on that because I'll let Phil ask his question. But it's interesting because I think sometimes when we think about art, we think about creative production, like we really think about value. We think like very famous artists are worth a lot of money, and there's this whole idea that we've both been very involved in the NFT space, and this idea that like scarcity and can then and the ownership of something then allows you to sort of tether your identity to it, and like so there's this thing over here which is all built about like how do we create a unique individual identity, which is really based on scarcity. I mean, if you're the Medicis, like you owned the world's greatest artists under your employ, and then you have this on the other side, you have this blowing up an explosion of creativity and content, and it's like also like this has been happening at the same time anyway. I mean, like you still have like Instagram created, millions of photographers. So there's a question in this, I'm sure, but like, I guess I wonder like how do you think these things are going to, is there going to be, is there going to always continue to be sort of a value of scarcity in creative production? Like, is that going to be a major thing? Or is it just going to transform with AI?
So my answer is yes, largely for a cynical reason, which is, and I would point to Magnus Resch has done a bunch of work, is an economist who studies the art market. And what I learned from his work is that there's a vanishingly small slice of the population that essentially controls the entire art market. So to put that in actual numbers, there are 10 main institutions and about 3,000 people in the entire world who determine if an artist can become, what we would call a successful artist, which is to say somebody whose art is their work. They make all of their living from the sale of their work. That is such a small number of people that it's sort of mind-boggling when you think about the amount of people who are trying to sort of work as an artist. And so that it is in their best interest at the end of the day to ensure that that type of sort of blue chip art remains a vehicle for speculative investment, so that they protect and increase the value of their existing collections, and that they protect their ability to keep being, quote, kingmakers. And it definitely is unfortunately a kingmaker industry. I think a different but similar phenomenon, like let's say a nicer version of that, or a nicer version if we broaden the sort of view, and Lauren also talks about this in the piece, artists are doing work that is has to do with their engagement in the world and their what's created as an embodied, fleshy being in this world. And so some of that will determine whether an audience wants to engage with their work. Like up to now, virtual beings and other types of like avatar based creators have been novelties, but when they're flooding the sort of marketplace of the commons and the marketplace of ideas, my sense is people will be less interested in engaging with them than a human artist. I think a human artist will always have advantages that will be hard for machines to compete with. So that's on the audience side. On the level of the person themselves, it really comes back to, again, trafficking in critical ideas and reflections about society, about history, about broader concepts that don't even necessarily have to be executed in a way that we think is like visually perfect. Like we saw this with conceptual art, where like it really comes down to what is the relationship that the artist has established with these materials, with the concept, and the way that they communicate it to the world. And I think that that applies to essayists. I think that applies to comedians. That applies to directors. It's a processual relationship. I don't think that scarcity is going anywhere for both good and bad reasons. But I do think the discoverability problem will sort of mess around with the scarcity dynamics of who becomes the scarce commodity, proverbially speaking.
No, I love it. That's super interesting. Well, I think there's also this thing too, which is, I know so many of these artist studios are like, it's not an individual. You know, people think that like Jeff Koons is a guy, and it's like it's really much closer to an agency. You know, like they're these like entities, and you know, I do wonder if you know, it's in some ways it's like, you know, it's almost like the inability of the human brain to like know that many different people. You know, it's like I don't know. Anyway, that's just. I'm like half on vacation, so my brain's not all there. Phil, I'll let you ask a question.
No, you're great. You're great.
Phil, do you want to go off, go on camera and ask a question there?
Yeah,
Hey, Phil?
I made a point in the chat, but I want to ask about something else. So,
Sure.
so meme culture is just accelerating. The life cycle of a meme is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So if you've got artists developing pieces based on their interpretation of what's happening in the real world at the moment, are you seeing any continuity over time, or are we just going to have a series of snapshots that memes that come and go, and the past memes just lose their value except for the one or two that the art market decides is the one?
That is a great question. And I think from where I sit, I would say that all of the above will happen. I think that there will be some artists who probably frame their practice as like surfing these meme waves. So a reference point that I would kind of point to today of artists who probably will become like a legacy kind of referent for a lot of artists is Mischief, spelled MSCHF. And so they're, to Josh's point, they're more of a creative agency than really like an artist, but they are consistently able to activate something in the zeitgeist. They don't, you know, they're not like batting 1,000, but they're really, really good at riding those waves. And I think there will be more artists who operate like them, where it's not so much that they're trying to, it's almost like the endless playlist approach is kind of their way of participating. I also think that when there is a ton of noise, we really crave signal. There's sort of this like contrapuntal motion where like when we feel super inundated, we like identify as audiences, we go identify the people who consistently deliver within a certain set of ideas, or from an artistic standpoint, what we might call a series. And so I also think that those folks, if they can sort of battle through the discoverability issues, then become more valuable in terms of attention over time, because they're consistently within a given topic or concept space, and not trying to even necessarily play at the level of the kind of like short-term, moment-to-moment, frame-by-frame approach. So, and you know, I think actually there's a lot of artists we could point to whose work operates that way. But I think this also dovetails with your point in the chat, which is like, we're also talking about a very complicated new relationship to history. And that's been coming up, you know, through these questions of deepfakes, and the sort of forensic quality of photos and videos to sort of prove that something did or didn't happen. And now we're having to let all of that go. But moreover, we're having to engage in a sort of mess of ideas, where I find this in myself, where now when I see a Twitter thread about a given idea or a set of images, like my initial position is I need to find out if this is information that comes from before ChatGPT and Midjourney, before I even give it any credence to read any further. And I think like starting to think about all of that mushing together, like the sort of like forensics problems that come up as a result of generative AI, but then also the ways in which artists sort of interact in that paradigm. It's all part of a sort of complex piece. Yeah.
I'll make a plug for a future Spaces talk. I'm having Michael Christopher Brown, who's a big National Geographic photographer and a war photographer, come on to talk about this. But he's like literally someone who's been in like legitimate war zones and taken shrapnel, and for him it's really interesting with he's been playing around with AI and thinking a lot about deep fakes and thinking about like how do you convey reality and how do you compose reality, and there's a really interesting kind of through line there about who gets to report on reality and how do they depict it, and like what is like adaptation of the real and what is presentation of the real. So we'll get into all that here, but I'm sure you have some thoughts too, Jeff.
Well, I was going to actually ask Phil what if you're still there, Phil, like what you think.
What I think, I'm going through this period of horror in terms of the future of AI and deepfakes and all that stuff. I'm not sure I can articulate a strong position right now, but I'm just concerned that AI and the way the technology is evolving so rapidly is pushing us into eliminating history and only thinking of the now, which is in the economic interests of a number of the companies that are developing the tech, but not necessarily good for society. So I'm working and thinking about that problem, how you get guardrails and all this stuff, because if we don't, we end up in the WALL-E future of other people convincing us that the world we live in is the right world.
I really appreciate that, all of that.
I actually have I always tended to be on the utopian side of this thing, which is I think about sort of the long tail of production that's capable, of being produced with this AI and like all the stories that don't get generated, and that goes to like meme culture, but that also just means that like we can tell more specific stories at a higher quality than we've ever been able to before.
Yeah, but that's like saying television is going to be the great educator. Didn't work out that way.
But it kind of did. I mean, look at the access to like the number of documentaries that are available. I mean, it brought in everything. I mean, there's obviously more pornography available today than any time in history, but there's also more informal education available as well.
I will say, as one of the last subscribers to Netflix DVDs, I'm thinking in horror that I will not be able to find movies older than 1990 going forward.
Yeah, I think as a related point, there's been an ongoing concern, and Phil, I'm sure you're encountering this. You've been encountering this for a number of years through your work, but like this parade of dematerialization is good in many ways, but we're also eliminating many of the methods of storage that are more resilient to destruction, basically. And so like, particularly when I read some of the, like when you're watching a Criterion film and it'll tell you how it was like the original film was destroyed, but then they found, they had different reels in different locations, and they were able to sort of piece it back together based on some sketch somebody had of the storyboards and stuff like that. You just realize how fragile a lot of media is, and how little care we put into making sure that it survives. So,
well, a complimentary point to that is I've got a friend who runs Flickr Alley, which restores silent movies. And I don't know where you go to find his stuff. And as we start losing DVDs, all these movies are out there. It's a discovery issue. And will the algorithms point us to them? Or will our only memory of John Kennedy's presidency be the movie JFK by Oliver Stone?
I don't know. I tend to think that that's kind of on the institutions to tell these stories in ways that are relevant. There is like the JFK library, and their whole job is to make sure that JFK remains a vital part of the contemporary conversation. And I would hope that they'd be employing contemporary tools to do that. But again, I do also see the volume of meme culture, and how that can sort of suck everybody in and suck all the air out of the room.
Yep. I know more about the Kardashians than the Canadian government.
I'm okay with that. Jamie, did you want to ask a question?
It wasn't really a question, but it's the thought, like, I mean, I'm a filmmaker, so I'm a huge film person, so I felt that. But basically, I've learned from a professor who is building things now for NASA that digital is completely way more fragile than physical is. So he's actually developing a physical way to store things on the space station, because gamma rays cut right through the space station and blow up computers. So all of the research is null and void almost instantly. But he also had talked to us about worrying about everything being stored digitally. And the idea that you're backed up on the cloud is obviously not a cloud, it's physical, and it's got water that's cooling it. So everything digital is actually extremely fragile, where they still back up movies on black and white film because it lasts longer, basically. Anyway,
Yeah,
that's
totally.
a question.
Oh, so sorry, just there's something weird happening with my oven over there. So I guess one of the questions that I have is like, are you actually personally dabbling in generative AI? Are you playing with these tools?
Yeah, so my attitude is like, you can't, obviously this falls within the sort of banner of like art and experimentation. This wouldn't apply to, for instance, like weapons technology, but my attitude is you can't have an informed opinion about these types of things without having tried them, without participating. So my background is actually in poetry, and so I'm actually working on a book that will come out in the spring called I Create Like the Word, which is looking at poetry in the age of machine intelligence and what does poetic production with these tools mean. And I'll reference a friend's story, which is that he was encountering a number of notable experimental poets from past eras when ChatGPT happened, just trying it for 5 minutes and saying like, oh, this will never produce poetry. And his attitude was, well, you're not, respectfully, you're not actually trying to put the level of care into your prompts that would potentially cause it to return writing that rises to the level of like what quality you would expect. And so he's actually done an incredible job with prompt craft, with actually figuring out like, what are the ways that I can sort of prompt these machines. So I've learned from him. And then I also, for my newsletter, all of my sort of main featured images, unless there's something that exists in the public domain, I go in and I make using Midjourney, and in many cases, like I'm able to evoke a sort of a feeling or a texture in a way that would be very hard for me to search out, even on the other royalty-free sort of resources that are already available to me. So, moments like that, I think, are already sort of weaving into what I do. And then adjacent to me, what I'm noticing is a lot of people are using it for concept and sketch, which is a subject of great interest and importance to me, as they work through their ideas. So those are the more practical ways that it's sort of occurring in my practice and near me.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, Blue Cadet had actually done a project with the MIT Museum where we did a collaborative poetry thing where you could actually co-author a poem with an AI. And the thing that actually was really interesting about that was like, it actually was like a very sort of emotional engagement, like you're actually in some ways, like, participating and collaborating with a thing is like, with this AI, I think was actually very kind of, I think people actually grew kind of like emotionally attached to the experience. And like, I think that's also really interesting to think that like, these are tools that you really do have to like engage with sometimes, like on a very personal, emotional and vulnerable level to like actually get good outputs from.
Totally. Yeah. And I also think, we're talking about questions of value too, when we're talking about this stuff, where it's like, there's financial and economic value, which we talked about, but then there's also like, what aesthetic and conceptual value are you bringing as an audience versus that you would expect to be receiving from an artist. And I think there are some domains where we're probably never going to quite rise to the level of these tools being able to hit you in a way that a human artist could.
Yeah.
But there might also be modes that you're talking about, which is where this participatory, spontaneous, playful approach to art making has a sort of deep resonance that would actually be impossible with another person, because you feel like it's like you doing it because you're engaging with a tool rather than collaborating with a person. And I think that's a whole category of like open exploration that I'm curious and excited about.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's also that, you know, the thing that one of the advantages that AI has over other people is that it also has like infinite patience with people, you know, and you can engage with it and prompt it and go back and forth, and it's not going to get sick of you and just shut you down. So I think there's something there as well, which is that, you know, in some ways it can give you sort of engagement that your friends and your colleagues or your family or your therapist might not be willing to afford you.
Yeah, it reminds me of a friend who got one of those vibrating massage like neck things.
Yeah.
And was raving about it because he was like, you know how when, you know, like in his case, it was his partner, like, you know, when your partner is giving you a massage and like at a certain point you kind of feel guilty because, you know, their hands are getting tired. It's like with this, you don't feel that at all.
Forever.
You can just run it for a half hour and not stress. So I do think that phenomenon will definitely sort of play out.
Yeah. No, I'm fascinated to watch it evolve. And personally, like I would encourage everybody to just kind of get into the tools a little bit and play with it, because like I think in all things it's, you know, wherever this goes, it's going to be because people like us or whoever are in it and commenting on it and critiquing it and also evolving it.
Totally.
All right. Well, Jesse, thanks so much, man. This was fantastic. This
it
exceeded all expectations. We'll keep the conversation going in person out in LA. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll be doing another one of these, in the near future. So you know, keep posted, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jesse. Have a good one. See y'all.
Bye.